and our first lesson is actually planning the project. Our objectives for planning the project in this lesson are being able to plan the project and its parameters, including its scope, requirements, resources, and constraints. And we're going to talk about all of these items specifically on an individual basis. First thing we're going to do is actually define the project requirements. That includes looking at the resources that are needed, any limitations that might be a factor, and workplace expectations. Resources can include contributors who are going to help you with the project, the budget per se, any tools or equipment that you're going to need. Limitations are really limitations of the project management role, especially for those of you who are not project managers on a daily basis. And then workplace expectations are really, how are we going to work on the project? What's the timeline? What do we expect of the contributors? And what is the expectation overall for communication and debriefing and feedback as well? Then we're going to talk about creating your project plan. And that's essentially, what is your strategy for this project plan? So once you define the project requirements, you've got to think about your strategy to actually implement the project and to launch it and to get it going. So we're going to talk about each one of these individually, and let's take a look at defining the project requirements first. Defining the project requirements. Let's take a look at some of the things that we need to consider with our analysis when we look to define what are the project requirements. Our key areas for analysis, or our things to consider, are the project itself. So what is it designed to accomplish? And what business need does it serve? The reality is you're probably going to get those answers to those questions from the sponsor. And we're going to talk about the sponsor in just a second. But the sponsor is really the person who's defining what the project is designed to accomplish, and also what business need does it serve. So you're going to get that information, and that's going to give you a key understanding of the importance of the project. It's going to give you an understanding of where does this project fall in relationship to the company's organizational structure. How important is it compared to other projects in the organization? So these are things to consider, and once you gather that information from the project manager and from the sponsor, you're going to actually be able to then think about, how important is the project, and then what is your strategy that you're going to take with this particular project. The project manager themselves, if you are playing that role, your responsibility is to ensure that the project is completed successfully. And the important thing there is that it's on time and on budget, and also that it meets the specifications that were set. So other responsibilities that include for that role are monitoring the work, the budget allocation. You might be budgeting allocated resources to certain parts of the project more than others. Certain parts of the project might be considered more important than others, and so you've got to think about how that budget is going to be allocated. And then negotiating. You're often going to have to negotiate for additional resources. This happens all the time with a project. Something goes wrong, you need more resources, you need more money, you might need more contributors. You're having trouble with some of your contributors, and you need additional contributors to help spread the work out a little bit more. Maybe you need more tools or materials. Really depends on what's happening. Unexpected things can happen during the project plan, and it's important for you to be able to negotiate effectively for those additional resources. Now, the sponsor. The sponsor is a colleague or a manager who has basically identified the business need that is driving your project. This person actually determines the objective, they define and verify the budget, the timeline, any constraints, and also who are the contributors going to be. So sometimes you actually don't even have a choice of the contributors that are going to be supporting you on the project. Those contributors are already provided for you, and then you've got to find a way to assign the tasks according to their expertise. There are other occasions where you may have full autonomy in terms of requesting who the contributors are. So it really depends on the project, the sponsor, and how involved the sponsor is as well. The other thing that you need to think about is the scope. This really refers to the range and the breadth and the parameters of the work that is going to be assigned. It defines what work will be done, essentially. And if it's an internal project, the scope is really defined by the sponsor. And if it's an external project, the scope is actually negotiated between the internal sponsor and the external customer as well. So basically, the scope doesn't necessarily include costs or budget all the time, but it will often include those, but usually that's something that's packaged in with the resources section of a project plan. So it just depends on each company. Each company does it differently, but in most cases the scope might have more of a general understanding of the budget, but it usually doesn't have a specific breakdown of the budget. That's something that's usually captured in the resources section. In the resources section, we're talking about the people that are needed to help support the project. We're talking about tools. We're talking about any equipment that you need or provisions, funding, facilities that are needed, information that needs to be attained in order to make the project come to life. Also, it can include anything that really needs to help any of the contributors be successful. So it could be software tools, anything that helps to make sure that that project is completed. And then you've got to think about risks. Risks are something that you really should think very clearly about before you even start the project. And what I would recommend here is that you actually talk to the sponsor in detail about what the scope of the project is and get a good understanding of that, because then that's going to help you think about potential risks. But some of the risks could be increasing costs. It could be delays in production. It could be there are errors or issues in the quality of what's being done. Risks can also be things like contributors are not qualified enough to actually do the job they've been assigned to do. So you've got to think about all those things, and you've got to really monitor this from the beginning. That's the key here. If you can monitor the progress of a project, monitor the time that it takes, the cost, the progress, the quality, and respond appropriately, you're going to be much more effective in helping to define the project requirements. In this slide here, you're going to see some questions that you can ask yourself to help you with key areas of planning and defining the project requirements. You'll see here we have questions in regards to the scope, in regards to the deliverables, resources, budget, and risks. So when it comes to the scope, we're asking what needs to be done. Can you get this defined in detail by the sponsor? What will be considered out of scope for this particular project? A lot of times you make assumptions that you're going to be doing X, Y, and Z, and you failed to ask the sponsor if something might be considered out of scope for this project. So there may be things the sponsor just doesn't want you to do or doesn't want you to be concerned with, and he wants to focus with you on certain areas of the project. Are there other phases of work that need to be completed later or by other teams? And you also want to make sure that you get this in writing. It's important to get the scope in writing. Whenever you do that, you're going to be able to then incorporate that into your total project plan document that you present to the sponsor as well as to the contributors. People are going to see the document in writing, and they're going to really pretty much sign off on that. So you want to make sure that you get it in writing, because then you can refer back to it if something's not being done. Deliverables. Has the sponsor specifically defined what the expected outcome is? Is there an outcome that's ideal over anything else? Is there a least successful outcome that would be acceptable? You have to remember there could be some constraints. Things can go wrong. And if there is a least successful outcome that you know is acceptable, then at the very least, it will still allow the project to move forward to its completion. And then how will quality be measured? Who will measure it? What are the actual measurables that you're going to be using there? So you've got to figure all this out, and a lot of times the sponsor can help you do that as well. It might be as simple as, you know what, you need to continually monitor the quality and the work that's being done. You need to provide debriefings to the sponsor as well as several other contributors. And you need to get approval on those key areas of the project. So it really depends on the criteria that's you decide and the sponsor decide together. Resources. Who will be assigned to this project? What will their roles and responsibilities be? How much time will each contributor have to work on the project? These are very important questions to ask yourself and get the answers to. Because once you know who's assigned to the project, and then you can determine what their roles and responsibilities are. Now keep in mind, some of these contributors you may have had a previous working relationship with, and so you know what some of their skill sets are, you know what some of their expertise are, and you can really assign the appropriate tasks to them based on skills and based on expertise. But there are going to be individuals you don't know that are new members of the team. Those individuals you're going to need to spend a little bit more time with. You might need to be able to have maybe a one-on-one meeting where you can talk to them and really get a gauge of an understanding of what they do, what their experience is working on different types of projects, and what tasks are appropriate to assign to that individual. And then the budget. How much discretion do you have with this budget? There are some projects that I have worked on, and let me tell you, the budget was pretty strict, and I had no leeway at all with doing anything other with that budget than what was stipulated. And it was very specifically defined. This was for this was for this, and this was for Z, and that's it. And there was no variation to that. If I had a problem and needed to get a variation, I had to get 100% approval from the sponsor, or it was a no-go. So I really didn't have any autonomy there either. So you've really got to understand what is your discretion with the budget. How are you, able to allocate the budget for different things? Can you shift it around a bit? Can you change it? Can you get more funds if needed? What happens if you need to renegotiate for more funds? How are you going to do that? So you need to think about these things. And then risks. Is the funding for the project secured or not secured yet? That's important to know. Are all of the contributors actually trained and ready to do the work that is available for them to do? Things that you need to factor in. How was the timeline determined? What happens if the project doesn't get done in the expected time frame? So think about these things, ask these questions of yourself, and jot down some information and try to get some answers. This will really help you to sort of flesh out what needs to be done in terms of the requirements and be able to start putting the project plan together so that you can actually begin the project. When defining the project, you also need to think about the constraints triangle. This is a very common thing that project managers look at when they're looking at managing a project. And basically, the constraints triangle is all about a balance between the three quadrants. So it's about time, scope, and budget. The hard thing is trying to find a balance between the three, and that is where what you continually have to try to do is to find a balance. You can't significantly change one side of the triangle without affecting the others. So for example, if I were to change the budget slightly, that means that affects the time in which I can actually complete the project and the scope. Because if the budget is being changed for the worse and I'm getting a decline in my budget, then that affects the amount of time in which I can complete the project as well as the scope of what needs to be done. Or if the scope changes, that affects the budget and the time frame as well. It could mean extra work that needs to be done, and that means we're going to need more time. It could mean we need more money, more resources. So you've got to try to continually monitor these three elements so that you can see if you can find a balance between the three. And that's the key to the constraints triangle. Criteria for judging a project. Depending on the type of project it is and the strategy for the project, you're going to have different criteria at any given time. I'm going to give you some general areas that you can think about in terms of judging the criteria for a project. Because once you define the project requirements, you've got to think about how you're going to actually manage and monitor that project as well. Some of the areas that you can think about for criteria are effectiveness, accuracy, completeness, aesthetic appeal, customer satisfaction, always an important one, competitive comparison, one that is often missed, believe it or not, and market response. When you think about effectiveness, you're asking yourself, how well does it serve its intended purpose? Does it actually solve the sponsor's business problem or meet the business need? In terms of accuracy, is it actually on scope? Does it meet the project specifications? Completeness. Completeness, you're really looking to understand, was it completed on time, on scope, and on budget? But also you're thinking about, were the tasks completed on time according to the time frame you gave to each contributor? You're also trying to determine, are the milestones attained in a complete fashion as well? Were they done on time, on scope, and on budget? In terms of aesthetic appeal, if this applies to your project, you're wondering if it appeals to the necessary or intended audience. So if that's what the project is designed to do, whether it's designed to appeal to an internal audience in your organization or an external audience outside, such as a customer or a contractor or whoever it is that you're trying to appeal to, you've got to ask yourself, is it appealing to that necessary or intended audience? And then customer satisfaction. Is the external or internal sponsor satisfied? Very important question. Ultimately, they are the ones that have to be satisfied as well. They're going to sign off on a lot of the things that you need, approve a lot of the stuff that needs to be approved, as well as give overall general stamp of approval when the project is complete. And then competitive comparison. How does it actually stack up against the competition? Is this project about developing a new product that competes with another company in the marketplace? Or is it about, maybe it's about improving your software package that makes your technology a little bit more, appropriate for customers in the marketplace today. So you've got to think about that competitive comparison as well. And then market response, how is it suited for the marketplace, or has there been a positive response in the marketplace? Again, these are all really specific to the potential project that you're going to be managing. So maybe not every single one of these is going to be used as criteria, but you might use most things like effectiveness, accuracy, completeness, and customer satisfaction, and maybe even competitive comparison. Market response, aesthetic appeal, just depends on what you're actually producing. Overall, the end-all be-all is that the project manager must define the criteria that will be used to judge the quality of the work produced. That's the most important part. Another thing we need to think about when defining the project requirements are the stages of the project. And generally, there are 3 stages of a project in any project that you do. There's the planning stage, the execution stage, and the closeout stage. In the planning stage, the sponsor is actually defining the project scope and identifying expectations. Also looking at requirements, resources. These include contributors and budget. And constraints, those can include deadlines. They can also include not enough resources. It really depends on the situation. The project manager during the planning phase is actually assembling the resources, delegating the work, and creating a schedule. And when they're creating a schedule, they're mapping out what tasks need to be completed, what time frame do they need to be completed by, and who is responsible for completing them. So it's really almost a task check-off list to make sure that all the tasks are being completed, and that you can also monitor and manage who's doing what at any given time, so that you can understand what's working and what's not working and make adjustments as necessary. In the execution stage, contributors complete the tasks and they deliver the work, while the project manager actually monitors their progress, refines the schedule, negotiates constraints, and balances competing demands to meet the defined requirements as well. So again, this is where we really execute the project, we're doing our task, we're moving along our schedule, and the project manager's responsibility is really to just monitor what work is being done, is the schedule need to be changed, sharing the schedule with anyone who needs to see it, and negotiating with sponsor or other people in the organization who approve any resources that are needed or can help with additional budgetary requirements. The closeout stage, the project manager actually evaluates the success of the project. debriefs contributors, giving them information on how the project went, what was successful, what didn't work so well, what do we need to do better the next time, and identifies areas for improvement. Shares credit with the group as well. It's important to give credit. It's important to start with a positive when you do these closeout stages. And it's also important to recognize the good things that happen with the project first and then talk about some of the things to improve. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later as well. When we think about defining the project requirements, let's talk about an example, and I think this might pull it all together for you. I was asked to manage a medium-sized project earlier this year to ensure that all of our materials were properly updated, e-learning modules were developed, and employees were trained based on a new software upgrade that we were going to be going through. Certainly managing this project was not my primary responsibility. My role in the organization is actually to train individuals on a daily basis. So a project management role was really out of my scope of what I normally do for my organization. And also the individuals who were assigned to help me on the project were not my direct reports. So this can always be somewhat of a challenging aspect of being asked to be a project manager when your project management role is really not what you do for the organization. So you're often working with people who don't really report to you. So there's a little bit of a sticky road there in trying to figure out how much you should be managing them or managing the project, and is there a balance between the two? And it's important to understand that your responsibility is to manage the project. A project manager's responsibility, unless these reports directly report to you, is not to manage these individuals. So my sponsor on the project was actually the Director of Enterprise Systems and Implementation. And I asked the sponsor to define in writing what the scope of the project was. I wanted to know the timeline, the overall budget, as well as my level of authority in managing these factors. I wanted to know what the primary objective was in terms of the software release. So I asked the director just to tell me flat out, what is the primary objective of this project? What is it that you overall want me to accomplish? And through our partnership, I got a clear picture that the most important aspect of this new release was to ensure that the employees were trained, that was number one, on the new software, and that it fell within the stipulated budget. I knew that I had to figure out how to allocate the resources appropriately so that we had all of the necessary tools to train the employees within the budget. The problem is that I knew from looking at this budget that I was going to have to need some outside resources to help me with the development of the materials because I didn't have enough contributors to do that. That meant I had to go back and renegotiate for more funds to support the outside consultants that need to be hired. This was a challenge, but my analysis justified the need for additional resources, and figuring this out early in the project was the key to the project's success. I was actually able to get the sponsor to approve the additional resources. I basically stated flat out that I could not complete this project on time, on budget, and on scope without the additional consultants to help with the actual updating of the materials. She basically said that's all she needed to hear, and that was it. I got it approved. So you've got to be clear, concise, and make sure that you look at all the angles and know what's expected of you. Take a snapshot of what the project's going to look like and really understand early on what's going to get in your way. That way, renegotiating, getting those requirements down is going to help you be much more successful. In this slide here, you'll see an assessment activity. When we think about defining a project requirements, I'm going to allow you to ask yourself a series of questions so that you can sort of think about what we've just discussed and then jot down some information so that you can refer back to it after you've taken this course. This information that you jot down will be very helpful for you when planning a project, defining its requirements. So I want you to think about a project that you were part of and the project manager that managed the project. How effectively did the project manager determine the sponsor's overall expectations for the project? Did the project manager determine the deliverables for the project? Did the project manager determine the resources and the budget? Did the project manager and the sponsor discuss the timeline for the project? Did they discuss known risks? You may have not been involved in these conversations, but based on how the project went, did it go smoothly? Was it done in a timely fashion? Were there lots of things that went wrong or things that just didn't work, you can get a good determination on whether that timeline was factored in or whether the risks were factored in as well. What additional steps would you take to ensure that success was the key item if you were the project manager of this project? So think about all of those things in your experience on the project. Jot down some information in response to these questions. Again, think about a project that you worked on. Think about the project manager that managed the project and how effectively the project manager determined the sponsor's overall expectations for the project. Did they determine the deliverables? Did they determine the resources? And do you think that they discussed the timeline and also the known risks? And then what if you were the project manager? What would you have done to ensure that there was success here? Jot down a little bit of information, think about these questions, and then don't forget to refer back to them at the end of this course. In this slide here, you'll see some guidelines that can help you with defining the project requirements. Develop a congenial working relationship with the sponsor. What does that mean? Well, basically, you want to make sure that you set a good tone with the sponsor, that you have a good working relationship. And if you don't know this person, then you should get to know them and sit down and start having conversations with them, which you're going to have to do anyway to get an understanding of what the project scope is, what the deliverables are, what resources are you going to use. It's important to have a good, solid working relationship with the sponsor because you're going to need to get their approval on many things throughout the phases of the project. If you have a good working relationship, it shouldn't be difficult to get those approvals or to get those things adjusted, updated, or even completed. Also, talking to the sponsor is going to help you identify the scope. What needs to be done? When does it need to be done by? What's the timeline? What are the deliverables? Essentially, what is the project designed to do? What are you expected to accomplish? Identify your resources. How much money do you have? Is the money for all the project as a whole? Is it only for certain parts of the project and you've got to use less money in other parts of the project? How many contributors do you have? What are their expertise? What roles and responsibilities do they typically play on projects? Identify the importance of this project relative to the company's other operations. It's important to understand that. You've got to think about when the company functions on the daily basis, what are they doing, what other projects are they working on, and how important is your project in the scope of all of that information. Identify the budget. Identify the timeline and deadlines. Discuss the constraints triangle with the sponsor. Ask the sponsor, is there one part of that triangle that's more important than the other, or is there a part of that triangle that I cannot adjust in any way, shape, or form over another? So in terms of time, budget, and scope, is there one thing over another that's more important? It's important to understand this because if the sponsor says to you, my most important thing here is just getting the project done on time. Yes, we have a budget. Yes, we have a scope. But if we got to get this project done on time. So if you need more money and it's going to help you get the project done on time, then I'm going to support you on that. So it's good to have that information up front. And also, don't forget to identify your known risks. Thinking about the risks before you go in and implement a project is going to make you much more successful. You're going to be able to anticipate what could potentially happen, and you'll also be able to think about how you would handle those situations so that you're prepared. So use these guidelines as a means of a checklist to make sure you cover all the aspects of defining project requirements. And I think you'll see that you'll be much more successful.